afternoon again, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm Beth Stroll with the TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health, and I'd like to welcome you to this month's System of Care Leadership Learning Community Meeting. Next slide. So this session and the next is a part of our learning community. Denise Sulzbeck and I facilitate the learning community. Next, please. We hold this learning community monthly, and it's designed to support leaders in systems of care, and that could be in states, communities, tribes, and territories, and it includes those both with and without federal grants. We try very hard to address topics that are important and helpful to you in your work, and we always welcome your suggestions for future topics, so feel free to email us with your ideas. This year, we're focusing most of our sessions on operationalizing various elements of the system of care approach, which was a need expressed by many of you. And today's session will focus on operationalizing system of care communication. We like these sessions to be as interactive as possible, so we encourage you to put your questions, comments, insights in the chat box throughout the session. We have also incorporated time for Q&A, and Denise and I will make sure that any questions you enter in the chat box are addressed. Now, just below the chat box, you'll see a box that would allow you to download today's PowerPoint presentation, and as a follow-up, you'll also receive a link to the recording of this webinar. And I want to mention as well that at the end of the session, a link will pop up for a very brief evaluation survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take just a few moments before logging out to complete it and provide us with your feedback. We do take it very seriously and use it to improve our learning community sessions. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that our next learning community meeting is April 17th, also at 2:30 Eastern Time, and the focus of that one will be on operationalizing leadership in systems of care, which, as you all know, is critical for accomplishing the kind of system change that's needed to expand and sustain the system of care approach. You may be familiar with the cutting-edge work on leadership done by Ellen Kagan, and she will be the expert presenter for that session. So we hope you'll put that on your calendar and join us then. Next. Tiara will put a link to register in the chat box for that next session, and you'll also get that in the follow-up email that you'll receive from this webinar. And as always, you will be able to find information in the TA Telegram and now in our new learning management system. I'd like to ask Tiara if she would take a moment or two to familiarize you with the new Absorb learning management system. So Tiara?
Okay, so Jess, can you hit the next slide for me? All right, so the Absorb Learning Management System is a central repository for online training, webinar registration, social media feeds, and the TA Network learning communities. So once you create a login, which was on the previous slide, but once you click on that link right below and create a login, you'll come to the home page. And if you look to the bottom left-hand side, you'll see an orange box that says TA Network learning communities. And if you click on that box, Jess, could you hit the very next slide for me? Once you click on that box, you will come to the catalog of learning communities. And so it has a variety of content, including surveys, webinar registration, video recordings, so past webinars. You'll be able to see monthly minutes, and also you'll be able to enroll and register into upcoming webinars. Next slide for me. And so once you click on that yellow button, you'll be taken to the Learning Community homepage. And as you can see, we have 3 learning communities set up right now. And to the far right is the System of Care Expansion Learning Community. And so once you enroll in that, we've already enrolled, so it says completed. But once you enroll, you'll be taken to the homepage where you'll be able to view any past webinars, any videos, view resources, and also enroll in upcoming webinars. And so, of course, the web address is right below there, and I'll also post it in the public chat. So please join our System of Care learning community.
Thank you, Tiara. Now, through the learning community, you will now be getting the follow-up emails to our sessions that previously came from Denise Sulzbeck email. So look for follow-up emails from the address that's noreply@myabsorb.com, and you'll receive the information, the resources, and the follow-up link to the recording of this session and all our future learning community sessions. So as Tiara mentioned, we encourage you to sign up for Absorb. It's a digital hub where you'll be able to interact and find all the resources that are available to you, link with your peers, ask for technical assistance and such, and we hope that you'll take advantage of that. Next. Again, today's session will focus on system of care communication, and the objectives are to gain an understanding of framing, what it is, how it works, why it matters, some common characteristics of that, some common communications tactics and why they might backfire. Also to begin to anticipate how public thinking can affect message interpretation, and then we will have time for questions and answers. Today's session is unique because it's the kickoff for a 4-part series that will be led by the Frameworks Institute. And you'll hear a little bit more about this later, but just to mention that the future dates are April 2nd, May 7th, and June 4th. And the presenters today on this System of Care Communications webinar are Jessica Moyer, who's an associate in the Research Interpretation and Application Unit. She will be the presenter, and the presentation was also developed with her colleague Jen Nichols, who's the Assistant Director of that unit, and they work as a team, and I'd like to thank both of them in advance for their great work in putting this session together. I'd also like to let you know that the TA Network will be offering a great opportunity for you to participate in the Frameworks Academy, which will help you learn to reframe messaging around your biggest challenges to have the biggest impact. It will be a subscription. There'll be one per state with multiple users. And we'll be sending this email invitation to a number of groups shortly, along with the recording of this webinar. And it will go to state children's mental health directors, clinical high-risk grantees, principal investigators and project directors, healthy transitions grantees, also PI and PDs, and system of care grantees, the PI, PDs, family leads, youth leads, social marketing leads. And how this will work is that with key leadership in your state, you would identify some things some themes that could fundamentally change mental health care for children and youth in your state. You would respond to the email by identifying your partners and the theme that you'd like to address, and then the TA Network will get back in touch with you about how you might participate in this academy. And before I turn it over to Jeff, I'd like to introduce you to our new Director of Social Marketing at the TA Network, Michelle Boardman, who's also participating in this webinar and who I know will be an excellent resource for you going forward. And now I'll turn this over to Jeff, who will get us started.
Thank you, Beth, for the introduction. Thanks to everyone for joining today. I am really excited to be able to kick off this webinar series, and on behalf of Jen and myself, we're both really excited to get to work with you all and to hopefully get to know some of you. There are quite a lot of you on the call today, but we're really excited to learn more about you and get to work together. I know that not all of you are familiar with Framework, so I just thought I would start out by introducing you to us as an organization and just telling you generally what our mission is, which is to build public understanding about important social issues. And that's kind of our main goal. And the way that we do that is by helping experts and advocates, folks who have committed a lot of time and energy to understanding these individual social issues, to helping them communicate more effectively with broad public audiences. So all of you are joining us today because you do this in some capacity. You talk about issues around substance use, mental health, or issues related to those topics, and you do that with various different segments of the general population. So what we hope is that you will get that value out of these webinars, that you'll find you'll be able to adopt some good general practices about how you communicate about those issues, and then also be able to adopt some specific tools. We're a research organization, so we actually develop and then test specific communications devices that can help build public understanding about those issues. So we will have some concrete tools to offer you to put into practice. So that's kind of our goal here. I wanted to just set up our agenda for the day, which is we're going to start off talking about some general challenges, talking about kind of just generally why communicating to broad public audiences is a complicated thing, what's helpful to have in mind when you set out to do that. And then we'll talk about some specific traps, that's the word that we use to describe tactics that kind of seem like they should work to overcome those challenges, but actually backfire. They don't work the way they intuitively seem like they should. So we'll flag those up so you know to avoid those traps. And then we'll talk about what does work, what's more helpful, what we know through our testing is effective in terms of some framing strategies. We're going to keep it at a general level today. In other words, we're not going to dive in too deeply into a specific social issue, but we're going to talk about framing more generally, how framing works, what framing can do for fields of practice. And then I'm going to introduce you to some of the tools that we develop at Frameworks and that we will, in future webinars, be able to hand off to you to put into use. And then, like Beth said, we have time at the end for some Q&A, and I hope you'll feel free to just ask whatever's on your mind. We want this to be useful and applied for you, so whatever you're thinking is helpful for us to know and can also guide what we include in future webinars. So that's our plan for today. I think we've already done this, actually. Beth invited you all to type a hello, type your name into the chat box, and maybe say where you're from. I wanted to just make sure that that is working because we have a couple of kind of interactive activities that we'll do throughout the webinar. So this is just kind of a check to make sure that you're comfortable doing that. You can all type into your chat boxes and we're able to read them. I actually can't see the chat box, so the way this is going to work is that Beth will read your comments and then she'll kind of sift through them, and depending on how many there are, she may need to just kind of select some that are sort of representative of the broader comments and read those aloud. But this way we can have some interaction. You can participate and I can give you a bit of feedback. And hopefully this will work logistically. We want to keep you engaged as much as possible. Hopefully we'll do this for future webinars too. So is everything working so far, Beth? Are you able to see folks introducing themselves in the chat box?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. Okay. So let's get to it. We're going to talk about what you're up against first. And I should say we're talking about communications challenges, but there are also opportunities in these challenges. We want to kind of build efficacy around the potential to communicate more productively, more effectively. So there are lots of opportunity here. And before we get into the challenges, I kind of wanted to get there through a little experiment. What I'm going to play for you next it's a short video clip. There's no sound. It's a little bit more than a minute long. And all you need to know at the moment is that I just want you to watch the video and we'll afterwards reflect on what you saw in it. And there aren't wrong answers here. This is just about seeing what you see. So take a look at this video clip. Okay, so here's my question for you. What story did you see there? And whatever you're thinking, whatever story you saw, just type a short description of it into the chat box.
Tammy says domestic violence, a violent father. Dennis says sticking together is safe. Cindy says the small triangle and circle, we're trying to stay away from the large triangle. Ernest with the house, the family dynamics. Angela potentially fighting by someone larger than the other two. Carrie, the big triangle is a violent bully. Selby, different shapes fighting about which one got to be in the box, and the final shape getting angry. Greg, domestic violence. Myra, two help each other to avoid violence. Melorine, large triangle chasing smaller triangle, and then small circle. Small circle and small triangle escaped, and Alice, large triangle wanting to control.
Great, thank you. That gives us lots to work with. Those are excellent. So there was a story there. There were lots of stories there. This is kind of the takeaway from this activity. Every time we do this is actually from an experiment by some psychologists who were interested in how folks made sense of those shapes moving around on the screen. And almost without exception, all of us see some story in those objects moving. Lots of different stories, but we all see a story there of some sort. And that's really important because as human beings, we think in story. We kind of see the world through stories. That's an important characteristic of kind of the human condition. The other thing that comes out through this activity is that a lot of those stories are shared stories. So we heard multiple people thinking about domestic violence. There were several different iterations of a kind of teamwork playing out, folks working together, helping each other. There were multiple kind of models of sort of a power dynamic, like a bully and then the smaller folks getting bullied. There were other interesting attributes that were assigned to the sort of characters in this story. Like I heard an emotion, someone said that one of these characters is angry. Often gender is ascribed to these characters. All of those things were not explicitly given to us in those shapes moving around on the screen. But they come from the fact that we are storytellers, the fact that we see the world in story and that we have lots of prior examples of having heard stories and made sense of the world through stories. So that's really important to know that in every case there are stories kind of out there. Stories help us make sense of any new information that we're presented with. The other thing, the reason that I point out that there are shared stories is because when we're thinking about communicating to a general public, the stories that are kind of most common across an entire culture really come into play. So they're stories that draw on the same kinds of models that we all have access to, that are kind of familiar to all of us. So we have a sort of model in our heads about the different shapes that a family can take, the different kind of relationships and interactions that play out in an individual family. Maybe we think about power dynamics. We have a model of what a bully and a person getting bullied, what that dynamic looks like, what sort of model exists. And these different models, these kind of shortcuts, ways of understanding a new situation are shared across the culture. They're also durable. They're things that have been with us for a really long time and actually don't change very much over time. They're enduring and they're defining features of us as a culture. We refer to them as cultural models for this reason. That's actually a term that comes from anthropology. But the idea is that these These are the underlying models that help inform how we see the world and how we make sense of new information. They help us think fast because they're shortcuts, but when we rely on cultural models, it also means that we're not necessarily digging deep. We're not necessarily thinking critically. We're maybe not attentive to how this new situation, this new information that we've been presented with, breaks the mold, how it's different from the lifetime of experience that we bring to this new situation. So when we're wanting folks to think more critically or to understand a social issue differently, the fact that these cultural models are out there presents a bit of a challenge. And it's true no matter what the issue is that we're wanting to talk about as communicators. There are always cultural models that come into play. We talk about this phenomenon, the fact that as communicators, we don't get to craft a message kind of on a blank slate, but actually the messages that we craft when we send them out to our audiences, they have to navigate through a really complicated ecosystem. It's murky, it's diverse, there's a whole lot going on there, and most importantly, there are already lots of stories being told. And the message that we create has to compete with those stories, or has to merge at least with those stories. So what we're interested in here is thinking about how we can craft messages that are mindful of what the stories are that are currently being told about the particular issue that we're wanting to communicate about, and also how we can navigate that terrain effectively. So how we can, for example, know which of those stories are really helpful, are kind of neatly aligned with whatever it is that we're wanting to say, and how we can craft our message in a way that sort of nurtures and fertilizes those particular models of thinking. And then the other side, the flip side of that coin, is how can we identify where there are assumptions and stories and kind of existing associations that are in tension with what it is that we want to get across, and how do we avoid queuing up those models which have the potential to derail our message. When that happens, when we as communicators aren't aware of this kind of complex ecosystem that we're entering into, we run into a problem that we refer to as you say, they think. So the idea here is you as a communicator say something which seems pretty clear. You've spent a lot of time crafting this message carefully. And as a standalone item, it makes a whole lot of sense. But when it is received by the public and when it is allowed to queue up various cultural models that exist already, it leads to the public, members of the public, your audience, essentially, thinking something that is actually pretty different from what it is that you said. So you're saying A, and the public is thinking B. Here's an example of you say they think problem. This comes from some research that we've done on adolescent substance use and misuse. So something that folks are advocating for better services, support services around substance use, and also prevention, early prevention of adolescent substance use. Say things like this. This is an example of something advocates might say. Preventing early use of drugs or alcohol may go a long way towards reducing the risk of addiction and other serious problems for adolescents. Makes sense. Here's an example of how the public might be thinking about the issue as a result of a message like this.
I think the age limit should be a little bit lower, because I think if they did their experimentation a little bit younger, then perhaps that we wouldn't see as much abuse as they get older, because they wouldn't think that it's that big of a deal, whereas usually everybody goes wild when you go off to college, or at 21 years of age you can legally do it.
Personally, my own experimentation definitely had a positive experience on my life, just like, I mean, it wasn't positive at the time, but like, I don't know, you kind of have to go through some dark places to kind of get to some better places sometimes. And so for me personally, it's kind of like, nothing should be done, because like I kind of feel like I needed to like go through the flames a little bit to kind of come back a little stronger.
So obviously the intent of this message didn't land where the communicators hoped that it would land. So it actually encouraged folks to think, well, maybe if we get younger kids experimenting with drugs earlier on, that they'll kind of get it out of their system and then they won't be inclined to use in more problematic ways later on. That likely stems from one of those cultural models that we know is out there, which is an understanding of adolescence as just a period of risk, of kind of unknowns, bad judgment, irrational behavior. And in this case, not feeling enough of the story and not anticipating that cultural model as potentially challenging the message of this communication actually led to really unhelpful thinking. It's fostering something that doesn't at all build support for the kinds of programs these advocates were wanting to build support for. Okay, so culture has kind of intercepted this communication here. What I'd like you to do now is think about comments or questions that you've heard from members of the public. And when I talk about members of the general public, I just mean folks who don't work or are not actively involved in learning about and thinking about and working as practitioners in the areas of mental health and substance use. So what are the comments and questions that you hear from those general public audiences? And which of them have kind of flagged up for you that there are some misconceptions, misinterpretations, unhelpful assumptions that are out there? So take a minute and just think about any that you've identified in your own experience.
Katie mentioned parents who use substances love the drugs more than their kids. People who get treatment aren't safe to be around kids. Angela, it's all normal for kids to use and experiment. Selby, kids who have problems grow up to be adults who have problems. It's already too late to help them when they are adolescents. Karen, drinking alcohol in small amounts during pregnancy is okay, no harm done. Jennifer, adolescents who are dealing with serious mental health issues are just going through a phase, and they'll grow out of it. Katie, pot is not dangerous.
Excellent. That's great. That also, just so you know, I'll get a hold of the transcript from everything that was entered into the chat box afterwards. Excuse me. And we can use that to kind of direct how we, what examples we include in future webinars. It's really useful to know what kinds of things you all are encountering. That'll help us sort of tailor the content of the future webinars. But actually, among the examples that you just shared, there are, you've already identified a lot of things that came up in our research. So we do research at the start of any project that we do to identify those specific cultural models that kind of come into play when we're talking about a particular social issue. And you've touched on several of them already. You've kind of observed them in your own work. So there are things like it's a lost cause. There's a lot of fatalism around not understanding how interventions or how prevention is possible, how those things can be helpful, and that leads to a kind of, well, there's no point. There's not much we can do anyway. And the thinking about kind of cycles of use and cycles of abuse, like when understanding that if parents use substances, that increases the likelihood that their children will use substances, and this way of thinking about the issue actually feels kind of deterministic. It can also be sort of a roadblock to helping folks think more productively about what is possible, how change is possible, how disrupting those patterns, which don't have to be inevitable cycles, actually can happen. So hold on to this. We'll return to this in the future webinars, especially where we dive into specific topics. But this gives us a great place to start, and noticing in particular where there's the potential for miscommunication is a great thing to have on your radar whenever you set out to communicate. Okay, so let's talk about the common traps. So these are things that when communicators kind of notice, as you all have in these instances, notice that you're having a sort of you say, they think experience where what you're trying to get across doesn't really seem like it's getting across in the way that you want to anyway. There are kind of a handful of things that a lot of us are inclined to fall back on, or that seem like they should help get that communication across better, resolve whatever that challenge is. We call them traps, as I mentioned, because they don't actually do that. They don't improve communication. They don't correct whatever it was that intercepted the message. In some cases, they actually exacerbate the problem. They make that miscommunication even more dramatic. So let's look at what these common traps are. The first one is providing more data. So there's a feeling that if folks aren't understanding what we're saying, we need to just throw some more numbers at them, give them the evidence, put it in a chart, give them the statistics that those kind of speak for themselves. And if we give our audiences all of the hard evidence that we have and that they need, they'll eventually get it. They'll sort of come to an epiphany and see the issue the way that is so clear to us. But that's not how data works. That's not how numbers work. In fact, the reason this is a trap is that including evidence in your communications, and in particular using data and numbers without sufficient interpretive cues, so without kind of leading folks into a particular statistic or piece of data with a clear message, and then also interpreting that number, that kind of data point with explanation and with context and with explicit communication about how they should make sense of those numbers, why you're putting it in front of them, and how you want them to understand them, how they kind of help clarify the bigger picture. What's likely to happen, and what we see actually happen over and over again, is that those numbers they become fodder for what we just saw, which is they become something that we tell our own stories about. When we're given empty statistics, we make sense of them using what we already have in our heads, using the assumptions and existing understandings, using the stories that are kind of top of mind for us already to make sense of those numbers. And sometimes it means those numbers actually go to work to reinforce an unfortunate misunderstanding of the issue, or other times just an unhelpful, kind of unproductive association. So we'll talk in future webinars about how data can be used. It can be used to help frame a message, but what you want to steer clear of is allowing data to be your message, allowing it to stand alone without sufficient context and without a clearer message that the data is being used to support. The second trap here is about correcting mistakes. So correcting mistakes is not the answer to a you say, they think problem. By correcting mistakes, I mean you all have identified kind of perceptions that you perceive to be unhelpful, or in some cases maybe inaccurate. It might be tempting to say flat out to your audience, I know you think this, I know you think this is true, but actually it's not, and here's what is true instead. Here's an example of why that strategy backfires. It's a myth fact sheet. We're all familiar with this format. This one happened to be produced by the CDC. The intention was to kind of bust some of the myths that are out there about flu shots. The CDC was wanting to correct those mistakes and help folks understand why getting the flu shot is really important. So this pamphlet says things like, myth, the flu shot can cause the flu. They know that's a myth that's kind of out there. And then they follow it up with fact, the flu shot cannot cause the flu. They're trying to correct that mistake. Some folks at the University of Michigan, though, studied how this pamphlet changed public thinking, how it was received and understood by the folks who had access to it. And here's what they found. The myths on this sheet were misremembered as true. So the myths represented what folks came away with. They remembered the myths, but unfortunately they remembered them not as myths, but as truths. The other thing was these mistakes, the misremembered myths, actually got worse over time. So the researchers that were studying this, they went back to the readers of these flyers 3 months after their initial point of contact and asked the same questions to assess what they remembered from the pamphlet. And they actually remembered more of the myths as true than they had the first time around. So this phenomenon got worse over time. And then maybe worst of all, the false information, those myths, in addition to being remembered as true, they were falsely attributed to the CDC. So folks are going around saying, the flu shot can cause the flu, and I know that because the CDC says so. And obviously that's not what the CDC was saying. The CDC was using a tactic that lots of communicators use that seem like they should work. It seems like it should make sense to just, nip it in the bud and call out the mistake. But actually, it doesn't do that. And the primary reason it doesn't do that is because when something is top of mind for us, when we have an understanding, in this case a myth about a social issue, but that's the thing that's kind of foremost in our minds, then when someone else says it to us, it has the effect of just reinforcing that idea. It's so much easier to reinforce what's already there than it is to pull back on that existing idea and replace it with something new, which doesn't necessarily make sense. It feels kind of jarring because it's different. It conflicts with what we previously thought. So stating a myth, even with the purpose of correcting it, actually reinforces it, has the unintended effect. So don't be tempted to develop any more of those myth fact sheets. A third trap is the tendency to want to communicate urgency, to emphasize what I'm telling you is a really important thing. We have to do something about it. The situation is dire, or this is extremely pressing, or there's a whole lot at stake. But emphasizing urgency is not something that helps build public understanding or shift attitudes and shift thinking in productive ways in the long term. And there are lots of examples of this tactic of emphasizing urgency. One of the reasons that it doesn't work is that lots of folks are doing it. So we have, sometimes it's referred to as compassion fatigue, but we kind of can't be on alarm all the time about lots of different things. We have sort of a limited capacity to get really worked up about something. So when lots of folks on lots of different issues are talking about what they're particularly focused on in a way that is that adopts sort of a crisis tone or that has that imparts a sense of urgency, we may have kind of a spike of empathy or interest or concern, but that can't be sustained. It's not something that helps us kind of function as whole human beings who have to think about lots of different things over the course of the day. And it's not something that helps us think about the issue differently in a way that can be sustained over time. So it's a trap because it backfires when the goal is not to get people worked up in the moment or to tug at their heartstrings or to make them have a really strong kind of acute emotional reaction. But when what we want to do is actually build understanding and support for how the issue works and what's needed in terms of long-term change and more kind of systemic, allocating resources differently or introducing new policies and things like that. Communicating urgency is not effective for those types of goals. So let's talk about what does work. And I've been using the word framing a lot. I'm going to take a step back and just describe what we're talking about, what we mean when we use the word framing. Basically, we're talking about all the different choices that we make as communicators, not in terms of the content of our message. It's not about what it is that you want to say. It's about how you say it. So framing involves choices like what tone you use. We just talked about adopting a crisis tone, but there are lots of other options, like a reasonable tone or an explanatory tone. So the choice of tone is a framing choice. Framing also refers to things like who the messenger of a particular piece of communication is. It refers to things like what order you put different parts of the message in, what things you emphasize, what things you leave out of your message, how you explain the processes that underlie what it is that you're trying to get across. All of this stuff has to do with the presentation of the content. And so it's not a thing, we say it's not a thing that is similar to flipping a switch. It's not either you are framing or you're not framing. Everything is framed. You're framing all the time, whether you are aware of the choices that you're making and how you frame your communication or not. And it's also kind of an ongoing thing. You are never finished when it comes to the work of framing. It's not that you framed your piece and then you can kind of forget about it. There are always there are always opportunities for reframing and continuing to make choices about how you present and disseminate particular messages. So a second kind of framing fundamental here is that understanding is frame dependent. And I touched on this earlier, but really that's just a way of saying the way we understand messages that are delivered to us depends on how they're framed. That's kind of a basic principle of framing. What you're looking at here is a graph that comes from some research that we did on addiction. This actually is work on addiction that we did in Canada. And in this case, we're testing how messaging on addiction policies and support for increasing addiction services, what kind of shared values were being queued up in those communications. Along the x-axis here, you can see three different values. There's the value of interdependence, which is like we should care more about this issue and support more funding and more policies that around support programs for folks who who suffer from addiction, because what happens in one part of the province affects what happens in another part of the province. What happens in your family affects what happens in my family. Our fates are shared. So for that reason, we should all care about addiction as a social issue. The second value here, ingenuity. The idea is we're problem solvers. We can use our ingenuity to solve this social problem of addiction. So let's get to work. It's kind of queuing up that problem-solving value that we all hold. The third value here is one of empathy. So this is the idea that someone who's suffering from addiction could be your uncle. It could be you. These are people who we know, who we live with, who maybe we are ourselves. We need to care about this issue because it's about being empathetic, and that's important. What we found was, when we tested these three values, we found that the first two did boost support for stronger addiction policies and support for increased programming, whereas the empathy value actually lowered support. When messages were framed with an empathy value, folks were less likely to support policies that offer addiction programming. One of the reasons why this is so important is because a majority of the communications being produced in Canada by these substance misuse advocates actually use the empathy value, and so they were trying to build support for something that they were actually decreasing support for in the way they were communicating about it. So framing has the potential to help folks understand your message, and the framing choices that you make have a huge impact on how they do that. A third framing fundamental here is about how frames are navigation tools. So it's just a reminder that your messages kind of have to strategically navigate this ecosystem. And in that way, they're tools. They give you options about what to queue up and what not to queue up, what to kind of steer clear of. It's important to keep in mind that there are multiple cultural models available. So we kind of have lots of different options in terms of how we reason through an issue. There are lots of stories that we all tell, shared stories that are dominant within our culture. And it's actually also the case that sometimes those stories conflict with one another. We have different ways of thinking about it that we don't necessarily think at the same time. So as a strategic communicator, you can make decisions about which of those stories are helpful to queue up and how to do that proactively so that you're guiding the kind of process of reasoning and thinking of the folks who are receiving your message. And then what we're ultimately interested in is those frames that work, the frames that do help you navigate successfully. The way that we define frames that work is by these 3 metrics that you see on your screen. So we're interested in frames that enhance knowledge about the particular issue at hand, that shift attitudes in productive ways, so away from harmful stereotypes or kind of negative fatalism, which I mentioned earlier, towards a sense of efficacy, a sense of curiosity and sort of a can-do spirit. And then frames that build policy support. So we're really interested in ones that guide people to support programs, policies, initiatives, structural change that actually leads to improved outcomes and improving the quality of people's lives. So I have an example here of a frame working in the ways that I just described in terms of encouraging someone to think about a social issue in a new way, think about it differently. It's a shift in attitude and perspective and kind of an enhanced understanding of the issue as a result of having been introduced to the frame. So this is a video clip again. It's a really short one, and what you're seeing, this comes from a method of our research that we call on-the-street interviews. Basically, it's where we stop someone on the street and we say, can we just talk to you for a few minutes? We start out generally by just asking some really very broad, open-ended questions about how that person thinks about the particular social issue that we're interested in. And then at some point in that several-minute conversation, we introduce a particular frame that we've designed that we hope will shift thinking in productive ways. So we introduce that frame. It's like a short paragraph, a little blurb or something. And then we return to those general questions and we ask again, so how do you think about that issue now? And what we're looking for is some kind of measurable shift in how that person thinks about the issue. So I'll show you what I have here is a before and after clip. And I just want you to see if you can notice how the woman, how her thinking has changed.
So what do you think about stress?
It's a normal part of development in my opinion.
What's the effect or the role of stress? Again, thinking about young kids.
That causes, in my opinion, long-term damage to a child. A lot of the emotional development, the learnings that are meant to take place wouldn't happen in that situation.
Okay, I'm going to play it one more time since it's really short, and I want to give you a chance to really notice what's different in the before and the after clips. What she's being asked about, as you heard, was the experience of stress during early childhood. So one more time I'll play it, and then I'll ask you to type into the chat box what you notice about how her thinking has changed in the before versus the after. Oops. Sorry about that.
So what do you think about stress?
It's a normal part of development in my opinion.
What's the effect or the role of stress? Again, thinking about young kids.
That causes, in my opinion, long-term damage to a child. A lot of the emotional development, the learnings that are meant to take place wouldn't happen in that situation.
Okay, so what did you notice about how the woman's response changed? Take a few seconds to think about it and then type into your chat box.
Tammy said her attitude completely changes from this is normal to this causes trauma. Angela, it changes due to the way that the questions were asked. And Cindy, she seemed more educated about the topic the second time.
That's great. Thanks, Beth. And that, I think, does sum it up really well. The last point about framing that I want to make is that framing has the potential to unite a field, to kind of bring the communications of many different people who are all working on the same social issue, but from different angles. They take different perspectives. They're kind of focused on different subsets of, kind of subtopics within that social issue. But together as a field, adopting a shared framing strategy is a way to make sure that all the different things that you're saying are compatible with one another. They're not conflicting with one another. You're not making each other's jobs harder. In fact, you're able to say things that reinforce one another and that are sort of aligned in a way that all lead to the same vision of social change. That's the potential that adopting a shared framing strategy can have. So when I mentioned that we develop and test specific framing tools, I wanted to give you an idea of what some of those tools, sort of the categories that those tools can fall into. I briefly alluded to some of these before. We look at different messengers. We think about the order in which messages are crafted. We do work around visuals. Visuals can be frame elements themselves and can affect how the content of text is interpreted. We are especially going to look at some values. I mentioned values as part of the Addiction in Canada experiment, and we will definitely be practicing with some values in our future webinars. Values have a really interesting way of orienting folks to a particular issue, queuing up something that we all already care about as a way to help folks see why we should all care about this particular issue as well. Metaphors are really excellent explanatory tools. So this is a bit of a teaser to give you an idea of some of the tools that are to come that we'll get practice with in the future. And I'm not going to go too far down into the weeds of our research process. I bring up this slide which lays out several of our methods, mostly just to say that our research falls into two broad categories. We do descriptive research, which is aimed at describing the current situation, describing public thinking on a particular issue, as well as distilling how experts think about that issue. We describe this as there's an expert perspective, there's a broader public understanding of the issue, and we're interested in kind of mapping the gaps and overlaps between those two sets of understandings, and ultimately closing some of those gaps to create a more informed public. So that's our descriptive research. Our prescriptive research is about developing and testing those devices, those specific frames that are designed for the explicit purpose of closing the gaps that I just mentioned. And we'll show you some more clips and give some examples as we go from each of these phases of our research. What you're looking at now is our theory of change, which is broadly how we think about the potential of framing to drive social change. So the idea is if we communicate differently, that kind of filters up into the discourse. So it's reflected in our culture, in the media, and those things shape how we as a society think, how we think about these particular issues. And the way we think about issues has real implications for the kinds of policies we'll support and the kinds of structural system-level change that we want to be part of, that we want to see and support and make happen. So this is how communication is connected to creating social change. I've mentioned that we work on lots of different social issues. I bring an example of a project that we completed about a year ago, which is on building support for aging services and age-friendly communities, and the idea that we should be thinking about policy and programs with folks across the lifespan in mind. So it's an example of how we can kind of track the impact of framing through our theory of change. In this case, we were doing things like helping advocates counter the cultural model of deterioration, thinking of aging as a process of deterioration, which is not a motivating way to think about including people of all ages in making for a vibrant society. So the shift here is from talking about vulnerable seniors to talking about aging as a process of moving forward, thinking about as long as we're aging, we're going somewhere, and there's potential in that. That can be generative and positive and helpful for thinking about how to make the most of everyone's contributions. And a similar kind of thing, we were raising awareness of ageism, but instead of framing it as sympathy for folks who are of a certain age, who suffer from ageism, appealing to the idea of justice, that combating ageism is something we all have a stake in. We want to live in a society that's just and where ageism is not allowed to thrive. Those changes in communication were taken up by advocates whose kind of professional organizations made lots of changes to how they communicate about the issues that they care about. We saw shifts in how, in the reference terms for who had previously been called seniors or the elderly, and started talking about older adults, which is a bit more of a reflection of the personhood of everyone. That was reflected in public thinking. That changed how we as a society, our kind of popular media, thinks about aging. It led to some resistance to, for example, the idea that there are so many products sold in our drugstores that are anti-aging creams, et cetera, and we started to think a little bit more critically about that. And then it also led to some real material, kind of concrete policy shifts, more funding being allocated to age-friendly communities, to intergenerational community centers and various programs. So there have been a lot of successes on this front and lots more to build on here. So that's the content for today. As kind of a recap, these are the big points to remember, and you'll have access to these slides. So this is kind of a good summary slide if you're trying to jog your memory about everything we covered today, which I know is a lot. I've thrown a lot at you. But these are the kind of takeaway points. So culture complicates communications, and thinking about the stories we tell as a culture, the dominant cultural models, has real implications for how we communicate, and knowing what the cultural models are can instruct us on how to design our communications, to cue up the productive ones and to steer clear of the unhelpful ones. These traps are ones we want to avoid. So avoid the myth-fact trap, avoid the unframed naked numbers trap, we call it. Framing involves making choices, and we'll be talking lots more about how to be strategic in the choices that you're making, how to be aware that you're making choices in the first place and make ones with intention and with a base of empirical evidence to support those choices as well. Understanding is frame dependent, just recognizing that how you frame your communications has real implications for how your audience will understand them. And that we've done research to identify some of those implications. So we know what the effect of certain framing choices actually is because we've tested them with public audiences, and we are eager to share our findings with you and have them be useful in your work. And finally, a shared framing strategy can create social change. That's the ultimate goal here, positive social change. So Beth mentioned at the very beginning, we've got these next 3 webinars on the calendar. We, in the interest of wanting to put together our sort of agenda and move forward with the curriculum, we've already designed the second webinar, which is coming up on April 2nd, and the focus of that one will be on framing children's mental health. We've got 2 more webinars after that, though, and we're really eager to be able to tailor them to your specific interests, to know what you would like to focus on in those 2 webinars. So we did some thinking about the topics that we've done research on that we think align with what we know you all are working on and thinking about. We put some suggestions here. We aren't limited to these, but these are the ones Jen and I came up with that we think might be most useful. And I would love for you to weigh in on that. I think because we have the chat box and we'll get the transcript of it later, if one of these stands out to you as being really useful, we can obviously choose 2 of them. But type the letter of the topic of the social issue listed here that you would most like to see covered in one of the remaining 2 webinars, and we will take into account those preferences. We also are going to move to Q&A now, and if you want to ask any questions about these topics or maybe spark some discussion with other folks on the webinar about what to focus on or which aspects of the topics I've listed here you think are most pertinent, we can definitely devote some time of the Q&A to do that. Just briefly, a reminder that we're available, Jen and I are both available outside of these webinars. We want to create opportunities for you to be kind of thinking about framing and using your framing skills as regularly as possible. So we hope to hop on some of the discussion boards that you all are already on. We want to participate in the learning management system. We've also crafted some framing challenges to help you think about specific tasks that you can do to kind of flex your framing muscle. I'll give you the first one in just a second. But we also are available for one-on-one framing help. You have our email addresses, including in this presentation, and don't hesitate to reach out to us if you've got questions, if you're working through a particular communications challenge. We are available and would love to have some conversations with you about how we might be able to help. So with that, your first framing challenge is this. It's basically to identify a trap, one of the traps that I walked you through, that you have fallen into recently. And don't be hard on yourself at all here. We all fall into these traps. We cover them in our trainings because they are common. They're things that we all do, and there are good reasons why we do them. They intuitively seem like they should work. But the idea here is identify a trap that you've fallen into. So maybe you cited a piece of data without sufficiently interpreting it, without ensuring that your message was stated clearly and explicitly first, and that the data you included supports that message, doesn't overshadow it, and certainly doesn't leave room for multiple interpretations of it. Or maybe you've created a myth fact sheet recently. It's not always in the format of myth and fact explicitly, by the way. It can just be, sometimes it's just kind of described in prose, like many people think of, etc. And that's accomplishing the same kind of a thing, where you're reinforcing exactly what you want folks to not think about. So identify a trap that you've fallen into recently, and then knowing what you know about why those traps backfire, reframe that communication to avoid the trap. And then framing loves company, so share your reframe with someone else on this webinar if you can, if you have that option. Otherwise, we can maybe share through the LMS. But get some reflection and offer others reflection on how that reframing process worked. I think that's a really important part of framing, is having some discussions around what is easy and what's challenging, and how it feels to kind of reframe the way that you're used to talking about something that you talk about quite a lot. And remember that we're here to help. So please reach out. We've just started the conversation. Let's keep it going. So I'll open it up now, and maybe, Beth, if you're willing to kind of share whatever comments or questions come in, I will be happy to address them, and we'll just see whatever is of interest to you all to talk about at this point.
Sure, and thank you so much, Jess. That was great information. We do have a question from Cindy. Can you go over interdependence versus ingenuity and what those look like?
Sure. So interdependence is the idea that, so I should say all of these, what a value is it's kind of a shared ideal. It's a principle that we know a lot of us care about, and the reason to kind of frame a message using a shared value is a way to generate buy-in. It's a way to say to a broad public audience, there's a big picture here. There's a reason that this social issue matters to all of us. But you can do that in a lot of different ways. You can queue up you have sort of a lot of different options for which shared value you queue up when you're aiming for that goal. If the message is framed with interdependence, the value that you're queuing up, the shared principle that you're kind of priming your communication with, is this idea that the big picture here is that this matters because our fates are shared. The decisions that I make have impacts on other people. The decisions and the outcomes of the folks in my community have a direct impact on me. We're in this together, basically. That's the message of interdependence. When it's used to frame a particular issue, in this case, it was used to frame messages about support for addiction services. So an example of a communication that was framed that way might be something like, folks who suffer from addiction are members of the community like the rest of us. Their outcomes are things that we are affected by, and the decisions that we make, the ways we structure our society, impact them. It's kind of they affect us, we affect them, and we're interdependent. The ingenuity value is about, the shared value here is about wanting to be problem solvers. We see ourselves as we have a can-do spirit. We've tackled tough stuff in the past. When we are confronted with a challenge, we rise to it and we overcome. We use our ingenuity. Appealing to that value to say, we solved lots of tough problems in the past, we can solve this tough problem that we're facing at the moment, which is the problem of addiction. That's a way to frame a message. Framing a message with a value is it's not a tool that's used to get into the specifics of how a social issue plays out, how it works, what the kind of processes and cause-effect relationships are. It's a broad way of kind of introducing an issue in the first place. But that's how those two values would look differently depending on which value you queue up. Does that answer that question?
I think so. Thanks so much, Jess. There's a question from Dennis about whether we're limited to the topics you mentioned, and a response by Michelle Boardman in the chat that we're not limited. I'm wondering if others might have ideas of additional topics, or if you also, Jess, might throw out some other topics that you found helpful with other groups before.
Sure, yeah. So I can say a couple of things. One is that on this slide you will see our website, and I want to invite you to just hop onto our website. We have a tab there where we actually list all the different issues that we have researched in the past, and there are a host of different issues. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, research-based organization, so we have a broad evidence base on many issues, but we're limited in the sense that we study specific issues, and we don't want to bring you recommendations that we haven't developed and tested on that issue specifically. So we are limited in some sense. We can't just talk about anything that we haven't studied, but we've studied many, many issues that I think are kind of adjacent to the work that you do, as well as being directly aligned with the work that you do. Like, I think some of the topics, in fact, let me just go back to this slide for a second. I'll just put the list up there again. So we are talking about children's mental health, and I put adolescent substance use first up there because I know that's something that at least some of you are thinking about specifically. I also, after creating this list, realized that we've got research on adversity in childhood and child abuse, child neglect, and maltreatment. That's something that may kind of be an issue that some of you are working on. If there are topics that you're thinking of that are not part of this list, feel free to flag them up, and we can absolutely create a webinar on them, especially if there's one that's kind of got a critical mass of you that are interested in it, assuming we've got research on that topic. And in some cases, if it sort of sits between two topics that we've got research on, we might be able to pull from each of those bodies of research to put together a discussion.
That's great. I think a lot of the people that participate in this learning community are interested in the system of care approach for children with mental health and substance use problems. I'm wondering if some of the research that you've done, while it may address these topics and some related topics, could be pulled together to really look at that kind of a coordinated approach to meet their needs, to provide treatment, to provide supports, and how to, in a sense, frame that concept of a system of care.
That's a great idea. I will do some more concrete thinking about what we can pull from to make that the focus. But I think you're right. There's definitely potential to do that.
Good, and it's great. And I think we have one from Greg saying, are these good principles for most audiences, the helpful frames? Obviously, context is important, but I was curious if the research had shown that these are useful for diverse groups or if they need to be adapted depending on whom we are speaking to.
That's a great question, and one that we get a lot. So the way that we conduct research is that we're thinking, so first of all, we're thinking about cultural models as sort of durable, long-standing, deeply embedded models of reasoning that come to play when we as the public are asked to think about an issue. So in that sense, we're thinking about those kind of not kind of what's in the media at the moment. We're not thinking about issues that kind of come and go. We're thinking about even not so much what people think, but how people think about the issues. So alongside that, when we develop framing strategies, when we're constructing these tools and then testing them, what we're focused on is tools that will create culture shift in the long term, which means we use a big tent approach. So we want to bring as many people on board as possible. We want to communicate in ways that that can productively shift how we all collectively, as a culture, what models we share, how we can move that kind of shared thinking towards more productive thinking. The question we get about kind of audience segmentation and how you tailor individual messages to specific subgroups of the population, that always is important, but what we want to do is basically not two things. One, not say different things to different audiences if there are kind of conflicts there, in the same way that if different folks within the field are saying things that conflict with one another, if individual communicators are saying different things to different groups, and those things aren't congruent with one another, they're not just different, but there are tensions there, that actually is hindering to the goal of broad social change in the long term. So it makes sense to kind of think about these strategies as working for the population as a whole. We look nationally at the U.S. population, and then just making sure that when you tailor messages to particular audiences, that they're kind of aligned with these broader strategies. They can be more specific within those broad kind of within the broad framing strategy, but they shouldn't be different. They shouldn't be things that that are going to hold back the shared vision for long-term change. It's in a way of thinking about immediate goals, which involve encouraging specific groups or communities to take individual actions or to meet short-term, immediate objectives. Those all should be aligned with a broader vision for how we want to move collectively in the long term. And we don't do the audience segmentation. We don't develop messages for specific populations. Since we're focused on culture change, we look at it at that larger scale and then invite you to think about how to, within that broad structure, there's lots of flexibility. You can think about how to use the broad framing strategy, but in specific ways to meet the needs of particular audience groups.
Great, thank you. Dennis had to sign off, but I think he was piggybacking on what I said, that how to tell the story of a system of care approach to your community is something I think that would be helpful to many folks in our group. And then a related question from Pam, in terms of system of care, I'm also thinking partnership as a topic. For example, partnerships with youth and families that we work with, and maybe engagement. Are those areas that you feel you could get into?
Can you tell me more? What do you mean by partnerships? And is it the partnerships themselves that you're wanting to talk about, or are you wanting to communicate in ways that encourage and build future partnerships?
From my interpretation of Pam's question, I think she's talking about, first of all, partnerships across systems and with families and with youth are central to the system of care approach. So I think she's talking about using communications to create partnerships, and her example is with the youth and families that we serve. So how do you use your communication strategies to achieve that?
Okay. Yes.
Pam, I hope I'm getting that right. And wanting to get other stakeholders also to believe that families and youth have a voice. So to get stakeholders to also understand the message being the importance of partnering with families and youth.
Great. Other stakeholders being who?
It would be from partner child-serving systems. It would be clinicians and other service providers across systems, and basically anybody who would be interacting with the youth and families that we serve. Social service, education, funders, and such. Pam is kicking in there. So I think it's partnerships there. Selby, we only have a little bit more time, but Selby has a related question also, is that there's a need to communicate more clearly to the community about the system of care approach and how to present the solutions we craft to overcome the barriers. So Pam's is more about communicating to the broader stakeholders we work with on partnerships, creating partnerships, the importance of partnerships with families and youth. Selby also about the whole idea of communicating about a system of care approach.
Right. Our research is more directly aligned with the goal of communicating to the public about the value of a systems of care approach and of establishing partnerships and bringing together multiple stakeholders. It's more tailored to that than to communicating to specific potential collaborators or partners to get them to work with you. Now, there is some overlap there because we all are part of the broader culture, and even like when we look at that kind of complex ecosystem and we'll walk through the specific cultural models within one of those ecosystems when we're talking about a particular social issue. But we notice in those ecosystems of public thinking that there is a fair amount of overlap between how experts and members of the broader public think about the issue. There are distinctions too, that's important to note, but even when we are experts on an issue, we're also members of the broader public. We also are, we are exposed to and influenced by and have access to those kind of dominant ways of thinking that are shared across the entire culture. So in that way, there are lots of things about communicating to the public that do actually translate directly to targeting individual audiences within that broader public.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. I'd like to just ask all of you to hang in for just a couple of minutes and use the link that will pop up to complete the very brief evaluation. But before we end, I would first like to thank Jess for your outstanding presentation and for the follow-up work that you'll be doing with us subsequently. For those of you that may not have seen this, I want you to be aware of the funding opportunity announcement FOA for a new round of system of care expansion and sustainability grants from SAMHSA. The link to that is being posted in the chat box. It's a great opportunity to fund your system of care development efforts, and we encourage you to check this out. Applications are due April 19th, Friday, April 19th. I also want to make sure to thank Tiara Brown from the TA Network for handling all of the technical aspects of this session and for doing it so well, as always. And another plug for the next Learning Community meeting that will be on April 17th on leadership, and also the next in the series of webinars from Frameworks on April 2nd. And you saw the links in the chat box. You can also get the links to register from the TA Telegram and Absorb. So thanks to all of you for joining us today, and we hope to see you in our Learning Community session next month.